I won't spend time on a lengthy introduction today because we are looking forward eagerly to this exciting lecture. I would just like to say that we are extremely happy and privileged to have one of the world-leading experts in mood disorders here today, Professor Allan Young, who is a pharmacologist from start and then now professor in psychiatry at King's College in London, living in Scotland, but at King's College in London. Professor Young has published extensively and is an authority not least on bipolar disorder, but in the entire, I would say, affective field and also psychiatry as a whole. So it's a great honor for us to have Allan here today. He will this afternoon be the faculty opponent when Alexander Lisinski defends his thesis on antidepressants. But today Allan will tell us about something that is both old and new and very exciting, very timely topic, and that is what is the role of psychedelics in psychiatry. Please, Allan.
Thank you very much, Elias. And it's a great pleasure to be here. And this is my first trip after lockdown started. So it's nice to go back to the world at large. My last trip just before lockdown was actually to Copenhagen, so it's obviously related to this part of the world. And it's nice to see everything getting back to normal. And as Elias says, I work at King's College London. I should say that I do actually live in both London and Scotland, because if my dean heard that I said I lived just in Scotland, he'd get very cross with me. So today I'm going to be talking about psychedelics. This is actually a version of a lecture that I gave in the United States a few weeks ago to NIMH, and NIMH wants you to put some questions in, which I've left in because I think they're illustrative. But to help me, I've left the answers in as well. This, of course, is London. You can see that we've got the same weather as you. And this is the barges bringing essential supplies after Brexit, things like petrol and groceries that we desperately need. So these are my disclosures. I'm employed by King's College London. I work in the UK NHS, so that's the hospital system. I run the mood disorder service in the Maudsley Hospital and the Bethlehem. We have a good relationship with the NHS, and we're getting a lot of support from them for our research. I do work with industry. I don't see this as being a problem. I do advisory boards and lectures. In fact, after this, I'm going to ECMP to lecture with Sage about their new drug. But I've got no shareholdings or other pecuniary interests in pharmaceutical companies. So the topic of today is psychedelics. It's interesting, when I lectured to NIMH to the scientists, they said to me in the questions, oh, we all took these in college. You know, there's nothing special about this. And that's interesting because many people have recreational experience of psychedelics and feel that they know about them. And there's also a history from the past of using psychedelics. But what hasn't really happened is they haven't gone through the formal drug development, drug evaluation process, which I think is very important because it's been developed to evaluate benefits and harms. And that's really important to inform medical practice and as a safeguard for the consumers of these treatments. So that's one of the basic thrusts of my lecture, is that psychedelics are drugs like anything else, and they should be treated as such. Now, some of you may say that's uncontentious, but we've got an example of another class or another drug that's not gone through that process, certainly in some countries, which is cannabis. So, for example, in Canada, where I used to work, when I was there, we had the option of prescribing medicinal cannabis, and there were lots of trials ongoing. There are still trials ongoing about cannabinoids, and we're doing some of these in London. But when the Canadian government made cannabis free to use, essentially treating it almost like a foodstuff rather than a drug, all medical research stopped. And in actual fact, the Canadian government funding schemes for research into cannabis stopped. And I think that's a terrible precedent. I would hate to see psychedelics treated like, baked beans or vitamins, because I think we need to know about benefits and harms. So that's a point I'd like to stress. So there are classical psychedelics, and you see them here: mescaline, psilocybin, LSD, DMT. Most of the research so far, and the research that we're doing, is with psilocybin. There were major problems with getting access to the drug, especially GMP, well-manufactured, safe drugs. But that's been overcome by a couple of companies recently. There is, of course, a literature on LSD. There's still one clinic that I'm aware of in Switzerland that uses LSD for medicinal purposes. I think LSD is a very interesting compound. I think its therapeutic possibilities are quite great. The one problem with LSD, I think that's admitted by everyone, is that the half-life is quite long. So if you have an adverse reaction, and we know this from popular culture, a so-called bad trip, it can go on for a prolonged period of time. And we're also doing work with variations of DMT. We've just had a grant from a foundation to look at this in a form of headache. So if we look at the pharmacokinetics and the pharmacodynamic observations, they're listed here. And you can see the principal mechanism of action is all at the 5-HT2A receptor. Now, I know there's lots of expertise about serotonergic pharmacology in this department and in this country. And we're going to hear later today all about SSRIs. I think the 5-HT2A occupies a very interesting place in the mechanism of antidepressant action. So for a long time it was discounted as being important. And the reason for this is, although drugs which are antidepressant and appear to have greater efficacy, such as amitriptyline or 5-HT2A antagonists, in experimental animals, ECS, which is the animal parallel of ECT, ECT, of course, being the most effective antidepressant, caused a paradoxical upregulation of 5-HT2 receptors. So people thought that it wasn't going to be important in the mechanism of action. That, however, seemed to be a species difference. If you look at the effect of ECS on 5-HT2A receptor expression in primates, non-human primates, it goes the same way as amitriptyline. And there's at least one PET study done by my colleagues in Vancouver that shows that ECT has the same effect. So 5-HT2A was pushed to the side in antidepressant action, but it's never really been rehabilitated with the new papers. And also, it's crucial to psychedelics. They are all, and I'll return to this later, they're all 5-HT2A partial agonists. This also raises the possibility of new chemical entities that act on that mechanism. So, and these are actively underway. And I'm aware of some, even some Scandinavian university spin-out companies that are developing this. The duration of action, as I've said, the LSD half-life is a bit long. The rest of it's fairly unremarkable. But it's interesting that much of the pharmacology that we would expect to be done with any new compounds hasn't yet been done with these drugs. So, for example, as far as I'm aware, the first dose-response curve, looking at the dose response for the psychedelic effects and the adverse effects for LSD, was published only relatively recently. And we don't really yet have a similar dose-response curve for psilocybin. And, you know, these are the first steps, really, in understanding drugs. So any drug treatment, and I'd go further, as I was talking to Elias and Hieronymus last night, I'd say any treatment, whether it be psychotherapy, drugs, or stimulation, should be evaluated for benefits and harms. I would also say that the mechanism for doing this is best evaluated for conventional drug studies, where we look at this very well. To some extent, it's there for devices, but it's certainly not routinely thought of for psychological treatments. As I said to Elias last night, we published an editorial in the British Journal of Psychiatry a few years ago about the harms of psychotherapy. I did this with a psychotherapist because the rate of spontaneously reported harms in CBT in the UK, in the government service, was about 6%. Now, obviously, these aren't rashes or people having nausea and vomiting, but there are things like dependency, destabilization of the illness, suicidality, and so on that are reported. And these are spontaneously reported rather than elicited. So I would say that the pharmacological, the psychopharmacological arena is advanced in looking at this, and other treatments should also be evaluated in the same way. And when we think about harm, we need to think about physiological harm or psychological harm. And these, of course, do overlap. Oops, sorry, this is... Right, so this is the famous paper by Dave Nutt, one of Dave's many famous papers, and he looks at the harm to users and the harm to others. And I think Dave, who's a very good friend of mine, was very brave in doing this and pointing out something which is fairly obvious but upset a lot of people, in that drugs don't divide into good and bad drugs. All drugs should be evaluated for benefits and harms, and as you can see, there's a continuum. And some of the drugs which are, of course, socially acceptable, like alcohol — we had some very nice red wine last night, I should say — these have harms which can be quite considerable. But if you look at the summary from Dave's paper, you can see that things like psychedelic mushrooms and LSD are towards the less harmful end of the spectrum. Now, that's not to say that they're not harmful at all. Of course, they might harm some individuals, but this has to be balanced against the potential benefits, the risk-to-benefit ratio. Dave himself was sacked by the UK government from his advisory position because he wrote an editorial about ecstasy, trying to contextualize the harms and comparing it to horse riding. And this was deemed to be offensive. But in actual fact, I thought this was really very clever. But of course, this was shown to the parents of kids who died, and they said, this man's terrible, and he was sacked by the politicians. But if you look at what Dave said, the harms of ecstasy are comparatively modest when considered in the round and against other drugs. And that's also true for real-life data. If you can look at this here we have opioids, we have cocaine, benzodiazepines, we have psychedelics, and we have, of course, dear old heroin. I think one of the absolute medical scandals of the last few decades is the opioid crisis. And we've seen this in the United States with really a catastrophic effect, which has contributed to a loss of life expectancy. And sadly, this is replicated in my home country of Scotland, where we don't lead the world in many things, but we lead Europe in having the highest rate of opiate deaths by overdose. And this is really extremely bad. And of course, there's a whole story about marketing and so on. I don't think that applies to drugs like antidepressants. And it certainly doesn't apply, if you look at it from this graph, to psychedelics, which are at the bottom in terms of the number of deaths. There's also some literature, and this is from the Journal of Psychopharmacology, looking at the US, showing that classical psychedelic use is associated with reduced psychological distress and suicidality in the United States adult population. Now, there's data that's come out since then that's saying this. I think when we look at harms, we need to look at evidence from trials. We need to look at side effect ratios. But I also think real-world data, the type of data that Sweden and Denmark and Finland are very good at collecting, where you get the healthcare system data, is actually very useful as well. And this is the National Survey on Drug Use, we're doing similar work at the moment, and we have a PhD student who's reporting this. But certainly there's no signal of concern in terms of the psychedelics causing increased psychological distress and suicidality, and if anything, the data goes the other way. And you can see from this, looking at lifetime psychedelic use, and of course remember this isn't randomized controlled data, there might be various confounding effects and so on, but you can see lifetime classical psychedelic use is here. Not sure if you can see this. Not sure what's happened to my, there we go. So you can see it's here and really stands in contradistinction to many of the others. And also that's true for psychological distress. So this is my first set of questions to the Americans. They make you do this when you lecture them. I'm sure many of you have done this, and you've got to produce learning objectives and questions. But just to summarize, psychedelic drugs, as far as we can see from the data, seem to be associated with relatively beneficial effects on suicide and suicidality, although of course that's always provisional. They aren't relatively harmful drugs. I mean, they're not harmless. Nothing is harmless. Many of you who've treated schizophrenia will know that drinking too much water, psychogenic polydipsia for schizophrenics, can be extremely harmful. So nothing's harmless, but they're relatively not harmful. Of course, they all cause perceptual changes, but they don't cause withdrawal effects, which is extremely important. Now, the 5-HT2A receptor is important for mediating the psychedelic effects. You can see that this is both a focus for psychedelics, such as we've been discussing, but also antipsychotics. And you can see a relative affinity here. I think this causes one of the problems that we have when we're thinking about using these drugs as treatments, because obviously if we gave them at the same time as a 5-HT2A receptor antagonist, we might nullify the effect. I personally would like to do some experiments where we do this in a double-blind fashion to try and block the therapeutic effect, but that's some way down the road. There's also the effects of other serotonergically active drugs that we give commonly, such as SSRIs. Now, it's an article of faith in the psychedelic research field that you have to withdraw people from SSRIs because they interfere with the psychedelic effect. Now, that's a strongly held belief. I'm not sure it's true, and it could do with being tested. But at the moment, for all of our research, we do withdraw people from antidepressants, which obviously has some risk because people may be having benefits from them. So there's much to be explored about the whole interaction of the serotonergic system. So this is just to show where the 5-HT2A receptor is distributed. As I've said, one of the things about the psychedelics is they're old drugs. Unfortunately, to get pharma interested, there has in making any new class of compounds, there has to be a commercial business case. And you know, it's interesting that that almost always applies. Of course, AstraZeneca and Oxford University didn't do that with the vaccine, where they did it for cost. But of course, Pfizer, of course, have seen a massive increase in their profits. But there's a potential of new chemical entities with perhaps different pharmacokinetics, slightly different pharmacodynamics, which may work in this field. And I think there's lots of groups actively working on this. And this may be an interesting area for the future. And the 5-HT2A receptor complex is on layer 5 of the cortical pyramidal neurons and also in the deep layer cortical neurons. Now, the current idea about antidepressant action is that it's somewhat beyond just a simple effect on neurotransmitter levels. I'm not sure about that because I'm aware, apart from anything else from reading Alexander's thesis, which is there, that you can show benefits of SSRIs after a week. And that's probably a little bit early, perhaps, for neuroplastic effects, but it may be an effect of the neurotransmitter level. But certainly the idea du jour is that treatments like ECT, ketamine, psychedelics all have this effect on neural structure and mechanism of plasticity. The cynic in me thinks that this idea is popular because it makes psychiatrists like me feel that they somehow understand the brain better than they do, or even understand drugs better than we do. But certainly there's some evidence that these drugs increased dendritic arbor complexity, promote dendritic spine growth, and stimulate synaptic formation. This, of course, hasn't been shown in humans and hasn't been correlated to antidepressant response in humans. But these cellular effects are similar to those produced by the fast-acting antidepressant ketamine. It's very interesting to me that if you speak to people in the general public, they often think of psychedelics and ketamine as being very similar. And they're both drugs which are somehow party drugs and taken recreationally. If you speak to scientists in the field, we say, no, 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 they're very, very different. I'm not sure how different they are in reality at all. Of course, they have a different mechanism of action. Ketamine probably acts on the NMDA receptor and the AMPA receptor, psychedelics via 5-HT2A. We treat ketamine and S-ketamine as a medical treatment. So when we give S-ketamine, we do it in the hospital, we do it in our clinical research facility, we have blood pressure monitoring, we have nurses, we have curtains on rings that we pull around the bed and so on. When we have a psychedelic treatment session, we do it very, very differently. And I'll show you some of the examples because that's supposed to facilitate the therapeutic effects. However, in the Journal of Psychopharmacology recently, we published a paper suggesting that if you actually give ketamine or S-ketamine in a psychotherapeutic milieu that's more like the psychedelics, you may boost the therapeutic efficacy. And that, to me, makes sense because it may well be enhancing the placebo response, the non-drug effects. Brain connectivity has been something of great interest in this area. It's another potential mechanism in some way. Net brain activity is not increased or decreased, but rather normally constrained brain networks, such as the default mode network, are deconstrained, and this is hypothesized to lead to increased connectivity and crosstalk between different brain regions. And the subjective elements of the experience are thought to correlate with changes in these brain activity, the so-called mystical experience or ego dissolution. And you can see here, this is just a schematic illustration of the brain connectivity pre and post psilocybin. And of course, this nice slide was made by one of my research assistants who's very, very involved in this whole area and talks about psilocybin therapy, doing all of these things where you increase flexibility. Obviously, as you get old, especially old academics, we're really inflexible. Our emotions are poorly, overly integrated, and our concepts are very rigid, and you can somehow move back to a more innocent, flexible state. So the idea is that psychedelics induce a temporary window of cognitive flexibility during which entrenched maladaptive patterns of behavior can be broken down. Now, this makes sense if you think about the rest of mood disorders, especially treatment-resistant depression, where rumination seems, the ruminatory patterns appear to be really a foci of depression in the brain. My colleague, Roland Zahn, who works with me, has done some very nice work, initially in the United States and now with us, showing that rumination, the persistence of rumination in recovered depression predicts relapse. Moreover, and Roland's got a grant from the UK MRC to look at this, you can reduce rumination by a biofeedback mechanism where you do imaging and you can see the brain patterns associated with rumination. If the person can reduce that, and that improves their outcome. So I think there may be a similar mechanism in the brain operating here. So the psychedelic drugs actually increase dendritic spine growth, The reduction in spine growth is like that caused by ketamine. Well, not really as far as we know. They don't reduce cognitive flexibility, and they do act on 5-HT2 receptors. Now, this is a graph from a paper that we did trying to look at the literature about psychedelic drugs. And as you can see, this is back to 1950, and it goes up to 2016, and there was a big change in the late 60s and early 70s. Now, the first point I like to make about this epoch is that things have changed dramatically from before 1968. And that's especially true of clinical trial methodology. So I think clinical trial methodology, and indeed evidence-based medicine, advances really quickly. We're currently doing our big 6-7 year review of universities in the UK, and it's interesting how much things have changed in terms of the way we look at evidence, and some fields have advanced in the last 7 years. One point being, of course, that secondary data analysis, where you get large data sets and interrogate them intelligently, is seen as being a very valuable way to look at things. So the methodology here was poor, small numbers, and there was often much argument. So, you know, the era here is when, for example, Michael Shepard in the Maudsley History was decrying lithium based on the poor quality of the trials. And what we know is that the lithium trials that were done later, using lithium as a comparator in registration trials for other compounds, really were much better done and answered all of Shepard's questions. So these are poor quality trials, but nevertheless we can get something from it. You all know that what happened here is essentially Richard Nixon, who caused the psychedelics to be banned. It's interesting looking back at the literature at the time, because there were arguments to the government in Washington that this was useful, that psilocybin and other psychedelics were useful, especially when combined with medical psychotherapy. And there was a plea to keep it for that use, but this was disregarded. And I won't go into the politics and the culture and so on and so forth, but nevertheless, this ban was followed throughout the world, and then essentially it dropped off a cliff. Apart from the odd, unusual place like Switzerland, which kept its LSD clinic. Now, I think the rehabilitation of psychedelics has got a lot to do with Dave Nutt, who very bravely took up the cudgel and reintroduced them by doing experimental medicine studies. So here's just a little bit of the data. You can see really small sample size, using terms that we don't really use anymore, dose ranging. I mean, even the diagnostic system, you know, DSM-3, which is probably the birth of modern psychiatric diagnosis, came in 1980. And you can see the variability in the methodology. But nevertheless, when we looked at this, and this is James Rucker, who works very closely with me and the rest of the team, we thought there was evidence that they might be useful drugs in unipolar mood disorders, where there's a huge unmet need and a real desire for new treatments. And as I've said, this was a signal of efficacy, but I've already talked about the relatively reassuring data about harms. So this is how psilocybin came back in. It came back in initially in the United States in places like Johns Hopkins, NYU, and California for people who had cancer-related psychological distress and people who were in terminal care for cancer in terms of treating depression. I actually wrote a grant just about the same time with one of my colleagues to give ketamine to people who were depressed and in terminal care. And my colleague is a psycho-oncologist, and he sees these people. And of course, if you have someone who's depressed and dying, you don't have an awful lot of time to get them better. So we thought the ketamine infusions might be useful, but our institutional ethics committee reacted with horror that we would seek to do this, which just shows how different people think in different ways about these things. But nevertheless, the Americans did these small studies, N of 12, showing reductions in anxiety, 29, improvement, 51, again, improvement in the Hopkins ones. And then Dave's small study with Robin Carhart-Harris, published only 5 years ago in the Lancet Psychiatry with psilocybin, which was essentially a case series, an N of 12, of people who'd had 4 failed treatments and looking at the response. Now, since then, Robin and David have published something very recently in New England Journal of Medicine, which essentially showed pretty much similarity to escitalopram and psilocybin. So the era is very young. So what are the pitfalls of psychedelic drug trials? Well, I've listed some of them here. Blinding. How do you blind a trial where the drug has a subjective psychoactive effect, which is thought to be central to its mechanism of action? How do you prevent participants unblinding researchers? Selection bias. Now, this is the only set of studies that I've participated in where we are flooded with volunteers. So we've actually got a database of 3,000 people who've contacted us who want to be in our psychedelic trials. And the database of people who want to join us to do research is almost as large. So it's incredibly popular. But people often volunteer because they are convinced it's going to work. So they maybe an interaction with the cognitive mechanisms that form belief structures. And how we work that out, please write your answers on a postcard and send it to me in King's College, London. Participants tend to know if they've received psilocybin, so they can change their answers to outcome scales. And psychedelics make people sensitive to context, but RCTs, so the way that S-ketamine is given, for example, are designed to specifically separate a drug from its context. I'm not sure if we haven't been doing that wrong for the last 20 or 30 years. I think in the big regulatory studies, we might have been better if we had standardized the psychological milieu rather than trying to reduce it to a minimum. And also, that would, I think, reflect good clinical practice with any treatment, where it's not just giving an SSRI, that's given in the context of a therapeutic relationship. Okay, so this is what we do. And I must say, when I say we, I mean mostly James and the team. People are recruited. We measure all the usual things, and you can see a list of them there, particularly depression scores. We are doing gene expression and neuroimaging, immune function. We then randomize to psilocybin plus psychological support or placebo. We measure again. I mean, as I say, there's the potential for doing studies where we have both groups getting psilocybin. One group has an antagonist. I think antagonist studies, and I don't know if Elias would disagree with me, but antagonist studies are a really neat way of examining mechanism if you've got the suitable antagonists. So, psychedelic drugs have not just been studied recently. They were studied a lot in the past. There's a rich old literature, but things were different then, and they've only recently been put through modern methodological studies. Our recent systematic review says there might be benefits in mood disorders, but really we need much more data. They're not easy to study in double-blind fashion, and we need to think about how to address that. And they cannot be studied regardless of the context in which they were given. I think if we did our psychedelic studies in the same setting as we give S-ketamine, we might produce more adverse effects. We do it actually in the same building. We do it in an adjacent room, but the team do actually change everything. So here's some of the studies. This is Dave Nutt's open-label feasibility trial. Some of my team took part in this. 20 females, quick inventory of depression, self-rated, and you can see this change in the depression scores over a number of months. Certainly seemed to be an effect which was beneficial, but not that striking. No serious adverse events, you can see, but there were some: mild anxiety, mild nausea, 3 instances of mild paranoia, 1 prolonged exposure where the person appeared to have ongoing effects which didn't abate until after 10 hours, and a post-psilocybin headache, but no prolonged psychosis or mania. But remember, it's a really small number. So trial criticisms: low sample number, pilot, really a feasibility and safety. I mean, I would be really loath to criticize Dave and Robin for this study too much, because it's one of the few studies where they had to get access to a drug that at the beginning was illegal. So they had to overcome massive legal hurdles to be allowed to do this research at all. Unblinded, uncontrolled, early phase, almost all self-referrals, people were believers, and of course, placebo effects. Now, how about delivering psilocybin therapy? So we are thinking about doing this with other colleagues. Of course, Imperial does it, but there's other local centres want to do it. But it's not trivial to do this. So it needs to be delivered in dedicated centres like day hospitals. There needs to be a prescribing and overseeing psychiatrist. Each patient needs their own therapist. It's a day patient treatment. You need a certain amount of psychological support before, during, and after the treatment, and this is going to be costly. Costs will be high relative to standard treatments. So, you know, in the New England Journal of Medicine paper, where on the primary outcome measure, escitalopram and psilocybin were the same, escitalopram is bound to be a lot cheaper. So it may well be limited to people with more complex illnesses or those who can pay for it. How often do you give it? How long is the duration of the effect? Well, the consensus at the moment is no more frequently than 3 months, but there's a problem that if there's too frequent treatments, there may be adverse events like psychosis. Cure in the treatment-resistant depression group was rare. It seemed to me have beneficial effects, but it was by no means transformative. And an interesting point, given that there's lots of commercial interest in this, is what's the commercial case? So you can't patent psilocybin, you can't patent various different things, LSD is out of patent. There may be new chemical entities, of course, but what some of the commercial interests are thinking about doing is somehow patenting the therapeutic process, and that's a novel departure from the usual business case, if I can put it that way. So this is how we treat. So this is what our CRF gets transformed into. We're actually almost certainly going to get a dedicated unit in the Bethlehem Hospital, which is one of our hospitals, which is a good deal more leafy and calm, and will be built to do this from the ground up. But at the moment, we do it in our CRF. So the session is supported by one specially trained therapist and chaperone. We've got the people from Hopkins who came across to do it. Treatment rooms are designed for a non-clinical calming session. Patients listen to a specially designed music playlist. I must say we had a great deal of argument about that because some people thought that they could design the music playlist that would be suitable for everyone for psychedelics. My own view of these playlists, having done a systematic review with a student a few years ago, is that music playlists are highly personalized. And so my solution was to let people make their own playlist, a bit like you would for birthing. But I didn't win that argument. And hence, to my mind, it's a bit like elevator music that gets played. So as a result of the session, patients often experience a sense of connectedness, emotional catharsis, and acceptance, which may be much more important than actual changes on mood scales. So there's relatively few studies which have been completed. The evidence base, compared to 6,000 people in regulatory trials of SSRIs is very meager, but there's lots of work going on in this area. And also, to some extent, it's almost like a therapy in search of a disease category to look at. So there's been lots of interest in, obviously, cancer, life-threatening cancer for anxiety and depression, There's interest in treatment-resistant depression. There's now interest in eating disorders. There's an old literature on LSD with alcohol, and I think it was Dr. Bob, who was one of the founders of AA, was very keen on that. Tobacco addiction, and so on and so forth. So I think we'll see lots of this over the coming few years. So psychedelic drugs have been shown in a small pilot study to help depression. There weren't really any serious adverse events, but remember the number is extremely small. If you think about the debate about SSRIs and suicide, that was based on a very small number of people in a very large database. It does require special training or knowledge, we think. Now, you might say you would say that. You've got a conflict here because you do the research. You want to keep it exclusive to yourself. But I think you'd need to be very careful if you were just going to set it up and do it on your own. And it's possibly going to be much more helpful in other conditions. It's possible we don't actually know the conditions where it will be most helpful for yet. So, what have we learned so far? What have you learned from my lecture? Well, you may well have known all of this, but classical psychedelics include LSD, psilocybin, DMT, and mescaline. Evidence for the human use of classical psychedelics stretches back thousands of years, but unfortunately it's difficult to determine from that the modern formulation of benefits and harms, although there is some literature before the 1970s that can be helpful. Classical psychedelics were used as medicines in psychiatry prior to 1970. It's an intriguing history. If you haven't read it and you want to read something of interest, that might well be looking at. But particularly for depression and alcoholism, at that time they were thought to be safe and probably effective, although they were screened, people were screened carefully for liability to psychosis, which I think is still important. And we also screen very carefully for people with addictive potential and EUPD. They all seem to work by partial agonism of the 5-HT2A receptor on cortical neurons, but we don't like much in psychopharmacology. That's not the whole story. They seem to importantly elicit a form of perceptual and conceptual disintegration reflected by increased neural entropy, deconstrained neural network crosstalk, particularly in areas known to be overactive in depression, PTSD, and addictions. It's interesting to me, as someone who's been involved in both the psychedelic research and the ketamine, more particularly the S-ketamine research, that the dissociative effects of S-ketamine, which occur in about 30 to 40% of people, are seen as not being important for the antidepressant effect. So this is something that's quite different. S-ketamine, the dissociative effects, don't correlate strongly with the antidepressant effect. They're seen as being a side effect, a bit like the blood pressure effect, whereas with psychedelics, they're seen as being central to the process. We have one of the big projects that we're planning is in PTSD. That's the next one, and we're doing that with colleagues in the United States. And further to our conversation last night, we're also very interested in potentially doing bipolar II depression, which is an under-researched area for therapeutics. Psychedelics don't seem to be particularly dangerous, but that doesn't mean they're safe. Remember, I'm a trustee of the Drug Safety Unit in Southampton, which does pharmacovigilance studies. And this is one of the reasons I think we should be thinking about these drugs, these medicines as drugs. I mean, Dave's argument about alcohol and tobacco, the risk-benefit ratio from alcohol and tobacco would never be approved these days. It's only because it's sanctified by long-standing cultural tradition. Their legal status is unscientific. Writing and research about them leads to media attention. I mean, the one way to pack a lecture hall is to invite Dave Nutt to give a talk on psychedelics. Virtually, people are sort of queuing around the building, which shows the interest in it, but also it's something that needs to be managed because there's expectations and so on, which can be unrealistic. Thank you for your attention.
this very interesting lecture, very timely and very interesting. It's now open for questions. We also have a distant audience that I welcome to this, and I said to Mikael Landén, who is in that group, that they could SMS questions to me, so they are also welcome. Any question from the audience? Yes, please.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're likely to see new chemical entities, so new synthetic psychedelics coming out. I know this because I'm on a scientific advisory board for a couple of companies that have been spun out of universities that are developing them. And potentially, if there's different pharmacokinetics, possibly different pharmacodynamics, slightly different, then that may make better treatments. I mean, as we know in psychiatry, for those of you who are clinical psychiatrists that prescribe drugs, we've got lots of SSRIs, we've got lots of atypical antipsychotics, but some patients do better on one than the other. So small differences can make a big effect. And also, I mean, the way the world is, you have drug development is costly, and you need money to do it. So there needs to be a commercial case, really, unless you convince the government to back it. And there's very, very, very few examples of drugs that have been developed by a government agency. And the only one I can think of is Lariam, which was developed by the US military as an anti-malarial drug, and that hasn't turned out that well. Question up there? Well, I think that's interesting because it speaks to the notion that the psychedelic effect is central to what's going on. And that may well be true, or it may not be true. But the dose-response curve for LSD that was published recently by the Swiss group is very interesting because, first of all, it's one of the first dose-response curves for one of these. But it showed that the psychedelic effects which were associated with benefit were relatively early in the dose-response curve, and the adverse effects kicked in later. So when I was studying pharmacology, and very much in an amateur way, I'm just a clinician, I'm not a proper pharmacologist, but it was beaten into me that dose-response curves are absolutely vital in clinical pharmacology. And so we don't even have this basic data. So I'd love to do a dose-response curve of psilocybin, and just see what happens, and we'll try and do that. But these are big studies, they require funding, and so on and so forth. Oh, no, it wasn't an experimental medicine study looking at receptor occupancy, the type of thing that they do in Sweden very well. No, it's just looking at the clinical effects, really, yeah, and the adverse effects. So, if you've got the dose-response curve there, with the increasing dose, therapeutic effects seem to occur early, or supposed therapeutic effects occurred early, whereas the adverse effects kicked in a bit later. Now, that's interesting, because that would suggest you can target the dose. One of the adages about the clinical use of drugs in psychiatry, to my mind, that bears true, is that we usually get the dose wrong early on. So we either give far too much or far too little, and it takes quite a long period of time to get the dose right. The early studies of olanzapine that were done by Stuart Montgomery, they initially gave a dose of 200 milligrams of olanzapine, which is an anesthetic dose.
First, I would just a second. We had one question here from the other guys, and also for questions you receive from the audience, they also say that it would be nice if you could repeat them because they don't hear them.
Oh, sorry.
No, it's definitely not your fault. But they ask, could you perhaps use cocaine as a comparator in a controlled trial?
Well, of course, Freud was very keen on cocaine. Robert Post, my good friend who I worked with briefly in NIMH, did a study of cocaine in severe depression, which I said this to a trainee recently and they didn't believe me, so I had to look it up. And what happened with cocaine in the severe treatment-resistant depression is it simply turned it into an agitated depression. I tried to do a study of cocaine about 20 years ago, having just come back from working with Bob, but I wasn't allowed to study it. They would let you study the paste, which if you have a nose operation to correct a broken nose, they put the cocaine paste up and as a local anesthetic, then they correct it. But the pharmacokinetics were wrong. So I think Bob's study, at least for depression, suggests cocaine is not going to be helpful.
Okay. And also risky to use as a placebo in a controlled trial, you would say. You wouldn't dare giving it to, if you want something to compare psilocybin with as a comparator, with some, not to unblind, you do get an experience.
Well, yeah, I mean, the issue of active comparators is one that bedevils the field. I mean, first of all, I think a really good design is to have the investigational drug, placebo, and an active comparator. And as I mentioned briefly about lithium, that's what rehabilitated lithium in these evidence base, because lithium had had studies in bipolar disorder from the regulatory trials of lamotrigine and valproate and so on, and really boosted the evidence base. But for psychedelics and indeed ketamine, what you're going to use as an active comparator is very problematic. In ketamine, they've used midazolam, which may be reasonable, but I think it's still open to question. People are talking about microdosing and giving small doses, and microdosing seems to be very popular in parts of California and perhaps other parts of the world where people feel Californian. There was a paper recently suggesting it didn't have any effect, but I'm not sure that's totally true. But again, if you're going to microdose, you really need a dose-response curve. I mean, that's the basic step.
If I may ask one question, you emphasize the difference between ketamine and psilocybin in the sense that it is the psychological experience that is important for the latter, but not the former. But are you totally convinced that there are 5-HT2A agonists that do not cause hallucinations? Are you convinced that they wouldn't have any such antidepressant effect if you give them? Are you convinced that it's all about the psychological experience, or could it be also more straightforward pharmacological effect?
Yeah, of course it could. I mean, the first thing to say is that my drawing the distinction between ketamine, S-ketamine, and psilocybin was more about their positioning, and they may be exactly the same. So it's perfectly tenable that ketamine and S-ketamine could do with some of the attendant things that we do for psilocybin, because I think they probably would help anyone. But also, it's perfectly possible that the psychedelic effect, which almost the ideology is that this is central, because it's seen as being almost a spiritual journey, that may not be true. But that's the type of thing that has to be examined, really. But, if you say that, and this is being recorded, people get very upset, so...
Yeah. Okay, I think Fredrik was first, and then you.
I don't know. I think I'd need to go back and check our data about that. I think my first answer is I think the recreational use seems to be different, at least in the UK. What happens with recreational use of ketamine is that people dose escalate and they take enormous doses, and then that makes them much more vulnerable to the urogenital effects. And we've seen young people lose their bladders because of the aseptic necrosis and so on. You don't seem to see the same pattern of dose escalation with the psychedelics. I think the reason for the dose escalation in ketamine is because of habituation to the dissociative effects, which are the desired recreational effects. So I think they seem to be different, and then there might well be other differences that come out. But we'll have a look. We've got a huge data set of real-world data like this that we are examining, and we may need to come and ask someone who knows what they're doing to have a look at it, Hieronymus, so you never know.
Okay, for the opponent to have the possibility to have lunch before the dissertation, we only have time for 2 more brief questions. You have one.
Yeah, absolutely.
Repeat the question, please.
Oh, sorry. So the question was about the therapy and about the fact it's one-to-one in the slides. I mean, the first thing to say, and whether there's any other way of doing it, potentially there are many other ways of doing it. What we did as a departure was for economy, we did it as a sort of group setting. So although there were therapists and so on, there were multiple people in the room. And previously that was thought to be the wrong thing to do, but in actual fact it worked quite well. I think the whole issue of therapy associated with the treatment is very open, and we're now seeing lots of possibilities with therapy being digital. I mean, potentially you could even have virtual reality therapy, which we do have for some things like OCD. I suspect it would need to be personalized. And I think we probably need, for science, to have a manualized, reproducible form of therapy. I mean, I'm not sure if any of you remember, but NIMH did the Elkin studies in the late 80s, the psychobiology of depression, where they compared imipramine, placebo, interpersonal therapy, cognitive therapy, and they had a placebo comparison psychological treatment called clinical management. And clinical management worked as well as cognitive therapy and as well as IPT. Now that produced a huge, and they all seemed to work if your Hamilton score was under 20, and then imipramine got better than the rest. Now that type of methodology where we try and standardize the psychological input, especially now that we've potentially got digital tools to do it, is, I think, going to be the way forward. One more question, I think?
Yeah, we have 2 questions here, final questions. One is about the risk for switch to mania with LSD or psilocybin. Would you dare to try? You said bipolar 2 could be interesting. Would you dare to try this in bipolar 1?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I mean, there's a terrible concern about switch to mania, and of course, I run a rapid cycling clinic, which describes the problems with the patients, not how we run around in the clinic. And of course, rapid cycling is very difficult to treat, but there's, especially in the United States, I think there's too much concern from some quarters about using any antidepressants whatsoever. I mean, I think in bipolar 1, you'd always want to have mood stabilizer cover, but I don't see any reason not to do it. And as we discussed last night, the rate of manic switch with things like ketamine and psychedelics seems to be really low.
Okay. And then a final question, very final question, and this is something that I missed it here. I hadn't heard about before, but it's the question goes like this. Do you believe that post-hallucination perceptual disorder, HPPD, as outlined in ICD and DSM, exists?
Well, I'm not sure, actually. The idea being that this may be an enduring consequence of psychedelic treatment.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, that's exactly the type of thing that needs to be examined. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, you know, I don't know about Sweden, but in the UK, we're seeing an awful lot about long COVID, and we're hearing a lot about the enduring effects of COVID. At least where I work, the clinics are being run by respiratory medicine doctors. A lot of this is phenomena that perhaps might have been not that unfamiliar to Charcot.
Okay, I think we have to stop here. Thank you so much for an excellent presentation.